Rich model's daughter smirked at Judge Caprio. What happened next shocked the crowd. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of scent that lingers long after city halls close for the day. Outside, a drizzle fell over Providence, turning Elmwood Avenue into a slick ribbon of gray asphalt. At precisely 8:42 a.m., the clerk's voice echoed through the chamber. Case number 251187, Alessia Moretti. The name carried a weight far heavier than the ticket it represented. Heads turned, cameras on phones tilted subtly to capture the moment, though no one spoke. Alessia entered with the deliberate ease of someone accustomed to being noticed. Her long coat, cream-colored with a subtle sheen, swayed as she walked, and the sunglasses shielding her eyes seemed almost theatrical, signaling a confidence that bordered on defiance. Her heels clicked against the floor in a precise rhythm, a quiet drum beat announcing her presence. And then, as her eyes lifted to meet the bench, she smirked. Not a polite curl of the lips, not a nervous twinge, a full, careless smirk aimed directly at Judge Caprio. The room inhaled collectively. Judge Caprio's gaze remained calm, almost gentle in its stillness. He waited, letting the moment stretch. Alessia, accustomed to smiles bending outcomes, expected something. A laugh, a raised eyebrow, a minor comment, a nod, a signal that her status could bend reality. Instead, he simply watched. The silence was heavier than any word, a tangible assertion that the courtroom did not operate on charm or pedigree. For the first time, her usual armor, the luxury, the connections, the expectation of leniency, met an unyielding wall of authority. She glanced at her attorney, who offered a subtle shrug, a silent acknowledgement that this was no ordinary traffic citation. The officer who had written the ticket, Daniel Riley, sat in the front row, clipboard resting against his chest, observing with a quiet pride. His presence reminded everyone that this was not a ceremonial gesture. It was the law being laid bare. Alessia's mind raced, calculating options, rehearsing defenses, imagining potential leniency. She realized that charm would not suffice here, yet habit urged her to try. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if the words would betray her. The ticket itself was deceptively mundane. A Maserati black, registration RI 9XJ344, caught on radar at 54 Mikromami in a 25 Minhaj school zone at 7:58 a.m., when visibility was reduced by light rain, and the crossing guard, Mrs. Hazel Durant, had already begun signaling children across Elmwood Avenue. There were photographs, precise measurements of stopping distances, and witness statements. But to Alessia, this was all background noise secondary to the real game. Persuasion, influence, subtle negotiation. She had never been wrong in situations like this, until now. The gallery of onlookers, a mix of local residents, journalists, and students observing the morning session, felt the tension immediately, whispered guesses about her family, the scale of their wealth, and her social influence spread like static across the benches. Some anticipated a spectacle, a lecture, a minor slap on the wrist, a performance of remorse. Others, the regular citizens who had watched similar cases, felt the anticipation sharpen into something more profound, the first encounter between privilege and principle. Alessia's smirk faded fractionally as Judge Caprio finally spoke. "Miss Moretti," his voice was calm, measured, but each syllable carried gravity. "You are here because you were observed exceeding the speed limit in a school zone. Children were present. A crossing guard intervened. You are a citizen before the law like any other." The words were simple, unequivocal, and yet they struck with force. For a moment, Alessia's mind blanked. She had never been called a citizen in this context. Never in her life had her identity been reduced to an ordinary responsibility. She could feel the eyes in the courtroom, measuring, questioning, waiting for her next move. Her attorney coughed softly, attempting to interject, but Alessia raised a hand ever so slightly, almost reflexively. This was a familiar dance. She would speak, charm, explain, excuse, redirect. But the judge's calm presence stopped her mid-motion. There was no bend, no give. The power imbalance, once invisible, now pulsed in every corner of the room. Her smirk had been her shield, her declaration of untouchability. It had failed. She shifted, a slight tilt of her shoulders, the tiniest crease forming between her brows. In that instant, the room could read every flicker of uncertainty she had spent years hiding. The officer noted it. The clerk noted it. Even the quiet crowd in the back row sensed it. The smirk that had opened the story, the emblem of entitlement and expectation, had collided with an immovable calm. And in that collision, the narrative had changed. As she prepared to respond, the first tendrils of doubt began to creep into her mind. Not about the ticket, not about the fine, about herself, her assumptions, the invisible rules she had believed governed her life. Judge Caprio's gaze never wavered, and Alessia realized, perhaps for the first time, that the world outside her bubble operated on principles she could not negotiate. The courtroom settled, breaths held in anticipation. Outside, the rain softened into a gentle drizzle, washing the streets of Elmwood Avenue as if nature itself waited for the next move. Alessia's smirk was gone. In its place, a quiet awareness. And somewhere in that silence, the first seeds of accountability had taken root. The morning light in Providence was muted behind a low-hanging gray sky, the courthouse steps damp from overnight drizzle. Inside Courtroom A, the air smelled faintly of old oak and polished brass, the kind of scent that clings to memory. Alessia Moretti arrived, not alone but flanked by a small entourage of attorneys and assistants, each carrying meticulously organized folders and laptops. Their movements were precise, almost rehearsed, as if entering this room was another stage, another performance. Her attorneys had filed continuance after continuance, citing international brand shoots, speaking in tones meant to convey urgent travel and professional necessity. Yet flight records later revealed a truth Alessia hoped remained hidden. She had never crossed state lines. Rhode Island had been her only destination, and the work she claimed was more a fiction than reality. Still, she carried herself as if she were untouchable, each step measured, each glance calculated. She smiled faintly at the gallery, as though acknowledging an audience that existed purely to admire her. The courtroom had grown accustomed to such displays in the past, but Judge Caprio did not. His eyes, steady and unflinching, scanned the file before him, noting the pattern. Missed deadlines, ignored notices, quiet calls from family contacts requesting leniency. Dates were circled in black ink: July 5th, August the 2nd, September 11th. Each notice sent, each opportunity to comply, had been disregarded. When he looked up and asked, "Miss Moretti, can you explain why these notices were not answered?" Her response carried the careless confidence of someone who had never learned to fear authority. "Oh, those! I didn't really think they were important," she said lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, eyes flicking briefly toward her mother's photograph pinned inside a designer bag. The words were casual, almost flippant, but the weight of the courtroom shifted in response. Every clerk, every officer, even the faint murmurs from the gallery felt the crack in reality. Entitlement, once invisible, had stepped into the light. Her mother, a model with national recognition, had donated to schools, local charities, educational programs that bore her name. Alessia's inheritance of both wealth and social influence created an invisible halo, one she wore like armor. "Tickets don't matter when your family funds city events," she had been overheard boasting in whispered confidence at parties, a comment now resurfacing in the gallery's collective memory. It wasn't arrogance alone, it was systemic privilege, an assumed immunity built over decades of influence. Officer Daniel Riley, who had been assigned the traffic case months prior, remained stoic in the front row, fingers tapping lightly against his clipboard. He had followed the pattern closely, documenting every rescheduled appearance, every ignored notice. "We gave her every opportunity," he would later recount in testimony, voice steady despite the undercurrent of frustration. Not once did she comply until the record forced it, and even then, it was because she could not avoid it. His presence was a quiet reminder that law enforcement observed, recorded, and remembered. The gallery shifted, some leaning forward, eyes wide, whispers suppressed but palpable. Ordinary citizens, used to witnessing the privileges of the wealthy bending rules, now felt a rare pulse of tension, the immovable fact of accountability confronting the gilded veil of entitlement. Alessia's usual confidence faltered as she recognized the pattern Judge Caprio had already pieced together. There was no negotiation in the calm of his voice, no hint of pliability in his posture. The attorney attempted to interject, offering a rehearsed explanation about travel and professional obligations, but Judge Caprio raised a hand, halting the motion mid-sentence. "Miss Moretti," he said, deliberate, "we are not here to assess your personal schedule. We are here to address compliance with the law. Your family's contributions do not exempt you from responsibility. Your choices, Miss Moretti, are your own." Alessia's lips parted slightly, a micro-expression betraying surprise, a crack in the facade she had relied upon for so long. She inhaled slowly, attempting to regain control, but the calm assertion of principle had already shifted the room. Every observer, from the elderly woman sitting near the back to the journalist jotting notes, could feel the imbalance, the subtle realignment of power. For a moment, the courtroom was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of paper, the quiet tap of a pen against a notebook. Alessia looked down at her shoes, then back toward Judge Caprio. Her usual posture, the slight tilt of her head meant to signal superiority, felt inadequate. She realized that privilege alone could not navigate this space. Authority was not swayed by lineage, connections, or wealth. The tension thickened as the judge continued, reading aloud each notice, the dates, the ignored opportunities. "Each instance," he said, voice steady, "was a chance to correct course. Each instance was ignored. Compliance would have resolved this matter months ago. Your defiance has been deliberate." The words were measured but precise, cutting through the performance Alessia had perfected over years of expectation. And in that courtroom, with whispers held at bay and attention focused entirely on the clash between assumption and principle, Alessia felt a subtle, unfamiliar pressure. The armor of privilege, once impenetrable, had been pierced not by force but by the simple, unwavering insistence on fairness. The light of accountability illuminated her actions, and for the first time, she confronted the reality that status could not rewrite history or erase responsibility. The rain had eased to a fine mist outside, the gray light seeping through courtroom windows, washing the room in a pale, muted tone. Officer Daniel Riley, 14 years on the traffic division, rose slowly, his posture deliberate, the weight of years and experience making every movement measured. He cleared his throat and adjusted the strap of his notepad. "On October 16, 2025 at 7:58 a.m., Elmwood Avenue, a 25-mile-per-hour school zone," he began, his voice steady but imbued with gravity. Visibility was compromised due to rain. Children were already entering the crosswalk. The defendant's vehicle, a black Maserati, was traveling at 54 miles per hour, accelerating rather than slowing. That is a clear violation, and it placed pedestrians at imminent risk. His eyes flicked to the gallery, and then briefly to Alessia Moretti, whose usual smirk faltered for the first time. There was a quiet tension in the room as every ear focused on him, but the atmosphere shifted further when Judge Caprio gestured toward the next witness. Mrs. Hazel Durant, 68 years old, crossing guard for Elmwood Elementary for over 20 years, stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. Her whistle hung loosely around her neck, and she gripped it as though it could anchor her resolve. I remember grabbing Caleb," she said, voice breaking. She paused, clearing her throat, her eyes momentarily closing as if to replay the scene. "He was just stepping into the crosswalk. I reached for him, pulled him back by his backpack straps. The car, it came so fast, I thought we wouldn't make it." The courtroom was silent, the gravity of her words settling like a weight. Each juror, each citizen in attendance, felt it. The immediacy of danger, the fragility of children, the ease with which a moment of recklessness could have become a tragedy. Officer Riley's detailed report had provided the facts, the numbers, the speeds, but Mrs. Durant brought flesh to the story, the shivering pulse of human fear. Her trembling hands, the catch in her voice, the repeated glances at the gallery for support, all of it drew the room into a shared understanding. This was not a simple citation. It was a near catastrophe, Alessia's usual confidence, the careless charm she relied upon, wavered. Her fingers, adorned with delicate rings, flexed nervously on the polished surface of her folder. The smirk, so carefully rehearsed for cameras and observers alike, thinned. For a heartbeat, she looked smaller, less untouchable, a person facing the real consequences of a moment she had thought trivial. She shifted her weight subtly, inhaling through her nose, exhaling slowly, a silent attempt to regain composure. Mrs. Durant, Judge Caprio asked, voice even but insistent, "Did you feel that the child was in imminent danger?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice stronger now, framed by a tremor of righteous conviction. "I didn't know if I could get him back in time. That car, it didn't slow. Not until the last second." She looked directly at Alessia, eyes steady now, carrying the weight of years protecting children in the community. Her age, her experience, her vulnerability, all contrasted sharply with the polished entitlement of the defendant. The courtroom seemed to collectively inhale, absorbing the moral magnitude of her words. Officer Riley added detail, his tone meticulous, leaving no space for argument. The speed limit violation, the weather conditions, the positioning of the children. It wasn't a momentary lapse. It was an escalating risk. The child's backpack is roughly 12 inches in height. The straps gave me a clear point of reference. Had Mrs. Durant not intervened, the boy could have been struck directly. This is not speculation. These are precise measurements and observations documented in the report. The combination of quantitative analysis and human testimony created a tension that could almost be felt physically. Each sentence, each pause layered with moral pressure. The gallery shifted subtly, some faces pale, others rigid with disbelief. A mother in the third row pressed her knuckles to her lips, thinking of her own children walking to school through rain-slick streets. A teacher scribbled notes quietly, shaking her head as if trying to reconcile the reckless behavior with the societal expectation of care. Alessia opened her mouth, perhaps to offer an excuse, a shrug, or a practiced apology. But no words emerged. The stories, the lived reality of potential harm, the panic in Mrs. Durant's voice, Officer Riley's precise recounting, had penetrated the shield of privilege she had relied upon. The room was holding its breath, and for the first time, she felt the collective moral gaze of a community she had assumed was irrelevant. "You see," Judge Caprio finally said, breaking the silence, "this is what we mean by accountability. Not simply a ticket, not a fine, but a tangible impact on human life. You cannot charm, deflect, or leverage influence to undo that reality." His gaze did not waver. These children, these families, they do not operate on your schedule. They cannot negotiate safety. And yet today we are given a clear lesson about the weight of choices. Mrs. Durant nodded faintly, and the courtroom exhaled together. The moral center of the case no longer abstract numbers on a page, but lived experience. The emotional gravity transformed the incident, turning a speeding ticket into a reckoning. Even Alessia's parents, seated quietly behind her, felt the shift. Her mother's hands gripped her purse, knuckles white, as if realizing that status alone could not erase a moment of near tragedy. In that suspended silence, the room understood the stakes, not in theory, but viscerally. The children, the vulnerable, the everyday guardians of public safety. Their voices had been amplified, their risks recognized. And Alessia Moretti, for the first time, faced the human weight of her decisions. The crossing guard's trembling testimony had revealed more than near harm. It had stripped away the illusion of untouchable privilege and replaced it with the stark, undeniable reality of accountability. The chapter closed not with resolution, but with the quiet tension of anticipation. The moral and human stakes had been established, and the path forward, the confrontation with evidence, with law, with conscience, was now impossible to ignore. The courtroom, still heavy with the residue of near tragedy, prepared for the next steps in a story that was no longer just about a ticket, but about choices, responsibility, and the fragile line between indifference and consequence. The courtroom had grown heavier by mid-morning, the faint hum of air conditioning barely masking the tension that clung to the room like a fog. Officer Daniel Riley straightened his tie, thumb tracing the edge of the report he had filed 3 weeks earlier, the ink still crisp in his memory. He had already spoken of the near tragedy on Elmwood Avenue, but now the conversation shifted, and with it, the stakes rose sharply. After filing the incident report, he began, voice measured but firm, I received 2 phone calls from a private assistant claiming to represent the Moretti family. The request was clear. Reconsider the ticket, treat it as a misunderstanding. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. A low murmur rippled through the gallery, quick enough to be stifled by a single cough, but enough to let everyone know the subtle current of influence had arrived. Alessia shifted slightly in her chair, adjusting the hem of her designer coat. Her fingers tapped almost imperceptibly against the leather folder she held, a faint rhythm that betrayed nerves she tried to mask with poise. Her mother's face, seated behind her, remained immobile. Eyes fixed on the bench but lips pressed thin, almost imperceptibly tight. Even with all the cameras and observers, all the rehearsed appearances of control, the tension was creeping past the velvet curtain that privilege often drapes over its beneficiaries. The judge Caprio lifted a hand, not in interruption but in stillness, allowing the gravity to settle. Discretionary review, he said, voice calm yet cutting, is a procedure that does not exist in this jurisdiction. He let that linger, and the courtroom absorbed it slowly. Requests to bypass legal process, to bend rules for social or financial standing, are precisely why fairness matters. A clerk at the front, her voice soft but steady, spoke next. I was approached, she admitted, to see if the citation could be rerouted for discretionary review. I had to tell them it's not a procedure anywhere in the system. I couldn't comply. Her eyes briefly met the judge's and then slid to the gallery, where a local journalist scribbled notes, fingers trembling with the revelation. The journalist whispered, half to herself, half to the colleague beside her. This matches 2 prior incidents. Tickets turned into warnings. Patterns emerged where consequences were avoided. The room seemed to lean in, collectively absorbing the invisible lines that connected status to the assumption of impunity. Emails were entered into evidence, each line revealing more. A business manager forwarding Caprio's public schedule to an unnamed number, attempts to monitor and, perhaps, influence the process before it even began. The notion that one young woman had skirted responsibility through charm and connections was replaced with something more disquieting. A deliberate practice, a calculated expectation of exemption. Officer Riley continued, his voice steady but edged with quiet frustration. This isn't speculation. These were documented communications, attempts to circumvent accountability. The pattern was clear. Requests from family representatives, attempts to redirect process. These actions are not coincidental. He glanced at Alessia briefly. The faint smirk she had relied on for protection was gone now, replaced by a subtle tension around her mouth, the sharp awareness that the veil she depended on had thinned. The gallery shifted as well. Parents of schoolchildren, teachers, neighbors, ordinary citizens who had gathered to witness a seemingly minor traffic citation now felt the pulse of something broader. Lines of privilege, so often invisible, were suddenly stark. The quiet, polite society veneer cracked, revealing the raw structure of influence and expectation that many take for granted. Whispers circulated, careful and deliberate, eyes darting to her mother, to the assistant who had been present only in name, to the officer who held records with meticulous precision. Judge Caprio allowed the murmurs to die down, his expression unwavering. In this courtroom, he said, voice firm and deliberate, wealth, fame, or social standing does not alter the law. Influence cannot rewrite reality. Every citizen is subject to the same rules, and every life potentially affected by reckless choices deserves equal consideration. His eyes swept the room, lingering on Alessia just long enough for the weight of the statement to press against her consciousness. Alessia shifted again, small movements betraying her internal calculation. She had believed, until this moment, that a family name, a history of contributions and strategic timing could shield her. That illusion was dissolving rapidly. Her mind ran through possibilities, dismissals, charm, strategic apologies, But the evidence now forming in the room made each of those options brittle, hollow. The collective attention, the meticulous records, the emotional testimony, and the documented patterns all converged to expose a simple truth. Accountability was unavoidable, even for those trained to avoid it. The courtroom held a tense silence as the implication settled. It was no longer about a single speeding violation. The pattern of expectation, the repeated attempts to leverage privilege, and the meticulous unfolding of these events revealed a larger moral calculus. Every gesture, every call, every email illuminated a subtle but relentless expectation that laws bend for some, while others remain bound by them. And in this moment, the audience, both in the gallery and within Alessia's own circle, understood. The velvet curtain of influence had been pierced, and reality, unflinching and impartial, had stepped into the light. The chapter closed on a collective exhale, the quiet gravity of exposure replacing the earlier whispers of privilege. The human and procedural truths had been laid bare, setting the stage for the next confrontation, where consequence would no longer be optional. The balance of power had shifted subtly but irrevocably, and the room felt it in every heartbeat, every exchanged glance, and every tense pause that followed. The courtroom had fallen into a quiet so complete it felt almost unnatural. The usual hum of shuffling papers and whispered exchanges gone. Tanya Turner, her hands wringing the edge of her coat, stepped forward. The lines of worry etched into her face were deepened by exhaustion, the remnants of sleepless nights since that morning on Elmwood Avenue. Caleb, he didn't want to cross the street, she began, voice tight and trembling. But the light changed too fast, and then, the car, he thought he was going to die. Her words floated through the gallery, soft but piercing, forcing even the most indifferent observers to sit straighter, to lean closer to the unfolding truth. Judge Caprio's hand rested lightly on the bench, a subtle invitation that carried the weight of authority, but the gentleness of human understanding. Caleb, he said, voice even, if you wish to speak, the court will listen, only if you want to. The boy's small shoulders tensed as he took a tentative step forward. Backpack straps clutched like lifelines, knuckles pale against the fabric. The gallery seemed to constrict around him, as though the walls themselves held their breath in anticipation. Caleb's eyes, wide and earnest, found Alessia, who sat with her designer coat folded neatly across her lap, sunglasses now resting on the top of her head. The casual arrogance that had marked her entrance, the smirk, the poised confidence, flickered and faltered under the weight of a child's gaze. "Why didn't you stop?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper, but cutting sharply through the room. "We were right there." The question hung, raw and unembellished, and the silence that followed was deafening. Alessia's lips parted, a small inhalation, but no words came. Her mind raced through rehearsed defenses, practiced apologies, the myriad ways she had once believed she could navigate around accountability, all of them colliding and collapsing in that single moment. She realized with a sharp, painful clarity that no amount of charm, no family connections, no carefully timed continuances could undo what had already happened. The danger she had caused, the fear she had instilled, was real, undeniable, and the weight of it pressed down into her chest with suffocating precision. Tanya Turner stepped closer, placing a tentative hand on her son's shoulder. He remembers the sound of the tires, the rain on his face, the fear in Hazel's eyes, she added, voice catching. He remembers you could have stopped. He remembers we could have lost him. Each word seemed to etch itself into Alessia's consciousness, dissolving the protective barriers of entitlement she had carried in. The smirk that had once shielded her evaporated entirely, leaving uncertainty, shame, and an unspoken understanding of her responsibility. The courtroom watched silently as Alessia shifted slightly, fingers twisting nervously in her lap. The polished, rehearsed exterior had cracked, revealing vulnerability. Her eyes flicked down, then up again, meeting no one fully, almost afraid of the depth of emotion surrounding her. Judge Caprio observed quietly, the stillness of his presence emphasizing the moral gravity of the moment. There were no lectures, no scolding, only the undeniable truth delivered in the voice of the innocent, unadorned and precise. Caleb's small frame seemed to swell with courage as he continued, a single, unwavering statement that would not be forgotten. "I was scared," he said, looking past Alessia to the gallery, to the parents and teachers and neighbors who had witnessed the event. "I thought I was going to get hit. I thought nobody would care if it happened to me." His words landed like stones in the still air, rippling outward. The reality of her actions, the near tragedy that could not be erased by wealth or status, settled over Alessia, forcing a first, reluctant confrontation with genuine moral reckoning. Alessia's hands unclenched, and she took a slow, almost imperceptible breath, the kind that comes when someone finally acknowledges a truth they had been avoiding. For the first time, the consequences of her choices were tangible, not abstract, and the protective armor of privilege offered no shield. She had been seen, not by cameras or gossip columns, but by a child whose life she had endangered, and whose fear had become a mirror reflecting the gravity of her actions. The courtroom exhaled collectively, a shared recognition of the shift. The power dynamics that had seemed so firmly in Alessia's favor were altered irrevocably. Here, in the presence of innocence, the moral imperative had asserted itself. The stage was set for the coming unraveling of pretense, for the confrontation with accountability that would follow, and for the slow, unflinching path toward recognition, restitution, and the beginnings of understanding. As Caleb returned to his mother's side, backpack straps clutched tight once more. The gallery absorbed the weight of the exchange, aware that the story had moved beyond a traffic violation. A child's question had cut through layers of entitlement, exposing a truth more powerful than any fine, any legal citation. Consequences are real, and they touch the most vulnerable first. In that moment, everyone in the room sensed that the real reckoning had only just begun. The courtroom held its collective breath as Alessia shifted in her seat, the polished confidence she had worn like armor now crumpling around her. She opened her mouth, attempting a casual dismissal, the kind of rehearsed shrug she had perfected over years of privilege. "It's really just a misunderstanding," she said, voice tight but deliberate. "I was running late. I didn't—" Her words faltered as Judge Caprio lifted the folder in front of him, the thin stack of papers weightier than any designer accessory she possessed. "Ms. Moretti," he began, calm but unyielding, "the record before this court paints a different picture." His gaze swept across her, not accusatory but piercing enough to feel like a spotlight. Mailed notices, dated July 5th, August 2nd, September 11th, all ignored. Attempts to contact court clerks to reroute or reclassify this citation. Calls from family representatives requesting consideration. All documented, all verified. The words landed like stones. The gallery stiffened. Even those used to her presence felt the shift. There was no smirk, no charm that could erase the weight of facts now exposed. Alessia's fingers twisted in her lap, her nails leaving faint impressions in the designer leather of her purse. She tried again, softer this time. I didn't mean for any of this to—" Her voice wavered, then vanished entirely. Every practiced excuse, every carefully timed story about brand shoots or meetings that never happened was contradicted in cold ink. Officer Riley's testimony, Mrs. Durant's trembling account, and the timeline Judge Caprio now recited formed an unbroken chain. There was no gap for improvisation, no loophole to exploit. The air in the courtroom seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. Witnesses shifted slightly in their seats, their eyes tracing her movements, sensing the beginning of a reckoning. Parents, teachers, and residents who had watched her glide into this court with an air of untouchable privilege now leaned forward, recognizing the unraveling of a facade that had always seemed untouchable. Alessia's mother, sitting near the back, adjusted her scarf nervously, her own composure cracking in subtle ways. "Why?" Judge Caprio's voice cut through the tension, deliberate and unhurried. "Do you believe that the rules applied to every other citizen of Providence somehow do not apply to you?" The question hung in the air, simple yet devastating in its weight. Alessia opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. Her mind raced, circling excuses, explanations, justifications, all of them crumbling under the precision of the court's record. She realized in that moment that the law, unblinking and impartial, did not bend to status, wealth, or influence. Her gaze dropped to her hands, now resting limply in her lap, and for the first time, she felt the truth of what her life had insulated her from accountability. A shiver of unease moved through her chest, a sensation she had rarely felt in 17 years of privilege. The arrogance that had been a second skin, the assumption that connections could rewrite reality, now seemed absurd, fragile, and exposed. The courtroom, once a space she might have dominated with posture and poise, now became a mirror showing her precisely what she had never confronted, herself. The gallery, silent and attentive, reacted to the transformation with subtle shifts. A parent exhaled quietly, a clerk pressed her lips together, a young law student scribbled feverishly in the margin of a notebook. The collective consciousness of the room, which had initially seen Alessia as a detached symbol of wealth, now observed a human being stripped of pretense. The power imbalance had shifted. What had once been a performance of entitlement had become a raw, unguarded moment of self-exposure. Alessia's eyes flicked up briefly, meeting those of Mrs. Durant, then Caleb Turner's mother, Tanya, and finally the boy himself. The fear, the vulnerability, the near tragedy. They were no longer abstract numbers or a statistic on a citation form. They were faces, expressions, lives that had brushed against hers in a moment she could never unmake. The smirk that had opened this case, the careless shield she thought would carry her through, was gone. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly, observing the young woman before him with measured patience. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction in witnessing the fall of privilege. Only the quiet assertion that justice, when applied evenly, speaks with clarity and inevitability. Alessia's collapse was not merely a social reckoning. It was moral, psychological, and deeply human. A soft, almost imperceptible exhale passed through her, a release of tension, a recognition of limits she had never acknowledged. The courtroom remained silent, but within that silence something profound had shifted. The rules, the responsibility, the weight of consequence, all had arrived at her door. She was no longer untouchable. For the first time, Alessia Moretti understood what it meant to face a truth unmediated by wealth, influence, or ego. And in that understanding, the foundation of the coming reckoning had been laid, setting the stage for the deeper confrontations and lessons that would follow. Judge Caprio's voice filled the courtroom, measured and deliberate, each word carrying weight beyond the literal sentence. Ms. Moretti, you are hereby ordered to pay a fine of $475 to complete 48 hours of community service at the Havenbrook Children's Community Center and to attend a safe driving educational program. All components must be completed no later than December 12, 2025, 4 p.m. No extensions will be granted. The clerk's pen scratched as she recorded the orders, the official seal stamping permanence onto what Alessia had always assumed were negotiable consequences. Alessia blinked, caught somewhere between disbelief and defiance. The fine, inconsequential to someone accustomed to spending thousands in a day, barely registered. But the community service, the mandate to step into the world she had treated with indifference, to be present among the children she had endangered, stirred a silent, sharp panic. Her perfectly curated composure faltered, and she pressed her palms against her designer purse, the knuckles whitening with tension. The gallery shifted subtly, sensing the transformation that had begun weeks ago, now reaching its first tangible moment. Parents exhaled quietly, a few nodding, as if acknowledging the justice in its measured, intentional symbolism. Teachers and crossing guards exchanged glances, their relief and quiet vindication mingling in the charged air. Even Officer Riley's shoulders relaxed imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement that accountability, however delayed, had arrived. Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward, his eyes locking with Alessia's for the briefest instant, not with anger, but with a steady insistence that she see what was required of her. This court does not meet punishment for the sake of retribution, he continued, voice unwavering. It is your opportunity to confront the consequences of your actions, to engage with the lives you touched, and to demonstrate understanding and responsibility. The court expects completion in full, on time, and in good faith. His words were calm, yet the moral clarity beneath them made the implications undeniable. Alessia opened her mouth, a faint protest forming, but the weight of every testimony, every timeline, every trembling voice she had encountered over the past two hearings stilled her. She thought of Caleb Turner, 8 years old, clutching his backpack straps as his mother held him close, eyes wide with lingering fear. She thought of Mrs. Durant, trembling as she described her near mistake in saving him, her whistle shaking in the wet morning air. All the voices, all the witnesses had etched a human reality into what she had once dismissed as a minor inconvenience, a trivial citation to be brushed aside with charm or influence. The courtroom felt almost holy in that moment of silence, a collective inhalation as the significance settled on everyone present. This sentence was not about dollars, schedules, or public appearances. It was a confrontation with truth. The children of Havenbrook, the guardians, the community volunteers, the neighbors who had silently endured her privileges, all would now intersect with her daily life in a way she could not ignore or evade. The lesson was precise. Status and wealth did not exempt one from the consequences of endangering others. Her mother, seated stiffly at the back, adjusted her scarf and shifted uncomfortably. There were no whispered phone calls, no quick legal maneuvers ready to overturn or delay. The court had closed every door for influence, and Alessia could feel the walls she had always relied upon crumbling. She glanced at the clock, noting that the time of the judgment, precisely 11:37 a.m., was now etched into her mind as the moment privilege collided with accountability. Alessia's chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. She wanted to look away, to retreat, to make the world smaller and more manageable. But Judge Caprio's quiet insistence left no room for evasion. Every person in that room, from the quiet law student taking notes to the journalist scribbling furiously at the back, witnessed a subtle but undeniable shift. The moment where illusion met consequence, where arrogance was met with structure and moral purpose. The smirk she had relied upon for years, the effortless shield of charm, status, and assumed invulnerability, was gone. It had met its limit, dissolved in the precise, symbolic justice of a sentence crafted not to humiliate, but to teach, to redirect, and to demand engagement with the truth of her actions. In that space, the courtroom became more than a venue for punishment. It became a space for transformation, where responsibility was tangible and unavoidable. As the gavel clicked, finalizing the sentence, Alicia's gaze fell, first on her hands, then on the front row where the faces of those she had affected waited silently. She felt a tremor of something unfamiliar, unease, awareness, the first stirrings of comprehension. It would not be easy. It would not be quick. But this was the moment the story shifted, from evasion to reckoning, from privilege to responsibility, from smirk to reflection. November 3rd arrived with the sharp bite of early winter. The sun barely broke over the horizon, leaving Havenbrook Children's Community Center wrapped in gray mist and frost that clung to the sidewalks. Alessia stepped from her car, designer coat buttoned high, gloves in hand, and for the first time in months, she felt the absence of certainty pressing against her. The fine had been trivial, the courtroom speeches formalities she had listened to with polite indifference. But here, among the doors painted in primary colors and the faint scent of crayons and old books, privilege could not shield her. She was handed a box of donated winter coats, straps digging into her fingers as she carried them down the narrow hallway toward the sorting area. The chill in the air seeped through her gloves, a physical reminder that this world she had long viewed from a distance did not bend to convenience. Children ran past, coats too big or shoes untied, and one little boy brushed against her arm, looking up with wide, curious eyes. "Are you new here?" he asked, his voice direct, unflinching. Alessia nodded, unsure of how to respond without the usual charm she wielded automatically. The first hours blurred with repetition, folding coats, sweeping floors, organizing books, labeling crayons. Volunteers moved efficiently, around her some exchanging quick smiles, others offering brief nods. But no one treated her like a celebrity or a donor to be fawned over. Every child's question, every request for help, required more than a passing acknowledgement. It demanded presence. "Can you help me with this puzzle?" a girl named Lila asked, her small hands pressing colorful pieces onto a table. Alessia's fingers fumbled, unfamiliar with real patience, unfamiliar with the silence that follows listening rather than dictating. As the day stretched on, she encountered families waiting for after-school assistance. A single mother, jacket frayed and bag heavy with groceries, spoke softly about the difficulty of balancing work and tutoring. A boy with asthma coughed, apologizing as he tried to tie his shoes. Alessia listened, at first as an observer, then gradually as a participant. Each story chipped away at the layer of detachment she had always worn, revealing the stark difference between her insulated life and the realities others navigated daily. By mid-morning, Alessia found herself in the reading room, dusting shelves lined with books that smelled faintly of cardboard and hope. She looked up and saw children sprawled across rugs, absorbed in stories, and realized she was no longer invisible to them, but also that they were not invisible to her. Their curiosity, unshielded by politeness or fear, cut deeper than any courtroom admonition. She answered questions honestly, stumbled over words when she didn't know what to say, and discovered that admitting uncertainty here felt safer than hiding behind pretense. Lunch came with the hum of chatter and the clatter of trays. A staff member named Miss Rivera offered Alessia a sandwich and a word of guidance. "Just keep showing up," she said, eyes steady. "They notice when someone really cares, even if you make mistakes." Alessia nodded, tasting the food mechanically at first, then more consciously, as if eating could anchor her to this new reality. She began to understand that effort, consistent, unshielded effort, held weight far beyond appearances. Afternoons were the hardest. Sorting educational supplies and helping children with homework brought blunt, unfiltered observations. "Why do you have fancy gloves?" a boy asked, tilting his head. Alessia paused, a reflexive smirk threatening, then replaced it with a quiet shrug. "I guess I forgot they don't matter here," she said softly, surprising herself with her own honesty. The boy nodded, moving on, and Alessia felt the faint warmth of humility settle into her chest, unfamiliar but grounding. Community reactions were varied. Some parents whispered disapproval at her presence, recalling her courtroom smirk, her reputation as a young woman accustomed to evading consequences. Others offered cautious curiosity, watching how she interacted with their children, silently judging whether she could be genuine. Volunteers who had initially given polite distance gradually allowed small smiles or brief guidance, recognizing her willingness to engage with tasks that mattered rather than optics. As the cold morning gave way to a pale afternoon sun, Alessia found herself carrying boxes again, her muscles sore in ways that no designer workout could replicate. She caught glimpses of her reflection in the window panes, hair slightly mussed, cheeks flushed, eyes wider and more alert. The decorative shell she had cultivated for so long was slipping, not because anyone forced it off, but because the work demanded authenticity. Every conversation, every child's question, every adult's quiet observation chipped away at the performative identity she had relied on, leaving her facing the raw edges of her own accountability. By the end of her shift, she stood at the door, watching children leave in coats she had helped organize, seeing parents relieved and thankful, and volunteers nodding toward her with subtle acknowledgement. The street outside was still cold, the sun already retreating, and Alessia realized she had spent a full day without hiding behind status, without a smirk to deflect discomfort, without the illusion of control. The work was real, the mornings cold, and the lessons unavoidable. And in that realization, she felt a fragile, tentative connection, not just to the community, but to a part of herself she had never known, the part that understood responsibility not as punishment, but as presence. The story that began on a rainy Rhode Island morning now traveled far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Local journalists who had once anticipated a perfunctory apology, a brief headline, and a quick fade into obscurity found themselves watching a different narrative unfold. Alessia Moretti, the young woman whose name had dominated city papers for weeks, was showing up every day at Havenbrook Children's Community Center, and she was showing up consistently. No cameras, no orchestrated statements, no social media posts meant to soften her image. She arrived early, sleeves rolled up, gloves dusted with chalk and coat fibers, moving quietly through the hallways and classrooms as if learning a new rhythm of accountability, one measured not by appearances but by effort. Teachers took note. Ms. Rivera, who had initially regarded Alessia's presence with polite skepticism, now paused in the library doorway to watch her kneel beside a student struggling with a geometry worksheet. Alessia's voice was calm, patient, unpretentious. "Try reading the numbers aloud," she suggested softly, guiding fingers along the page. There were no smirks, no flippant gestures, no hint of the entitled detachment that had once dominated her courtroom presence. Each day, she carried the weight of responsibility, not as a punishment, but as a living lesson. Tanya Turner, Caleb's mother, admitted to journalists that her own perception had shifted. At first, she had feared another performance, another hollow attempt at restitution meant for public consumption. Yet when Caleb spoke quietly at the dinner table about how Alessia had helped him with reading after school, his excitement genuine, she felt her reservations soften. "I didn't expect this," she confessed, eyes meeting the reporters. "I expected excuses or anger. What I saw instead was someone showing up when no one was watching." Caleb himself grinned, recounting moments when Alessia patiently guided him through sight words, celebrated his progress, and treated him not as a case or a story, but as a child with real challenges. Law students at nearby universities began citing the case as an exemplar of restorative justice in practice. They came to Havenbrook to observe, to interview staff, to document how a system that often feels punitive could, when combined with personal accountability, foster learning, growth, and empathy. Alessia's engagement became a classroom in itself, demonstrating the transformation possible when consequences are real, unavoidable, and meaningful. She moved among the children and staff with humility, slowly dismantling the persona that had relied on family wealth and societal privilege. The story began to ripple outward, beyond the center and the city streets. Coffee shops buzzed with conversations about civic responsibility. Neighborhood book clubs debated what it meant to make amends. Classrooms held discussions on the balance between privilege, law, and morality. Alessia's name no longer evoked outrage alone. It evoked questions. What does it mean to truly face the consequences of one's actions? What does humility require? How does one rebuild trust? And why is consistency more powerful than a single act of contrition? Even among critics, a grudging respect began to emerge. Social media threads once filled with scorn turned to discussion, analysis, and in some corners, admiration for the work ethic she displayed day after day. The transformation was neither sudden nor spectacular. It was gradual, visible only in the small choices she made, the conversations she engaged in, the patience she extended to children who asked blunt, honest questions without flattery. Community members who recognized her on the street offered mixed reactions. Some nodded with curiosity, cautious optimism in their eyes. Others lingered, still skeptical, watching for any slip, any hint of performance. And yet she returned each day, rising before the center opened, staying until the last child was gone, and completing each task with the same quiet diligence. The ritual itself, consistent, observable, grounded in service, shifted public perception. Accountability, when approached with integrity, had a visible, tangible effect. By the time December approached, Alessia's story had settled into the city's consciousness, not as scandal, but as a case study in reflection and civic awakening. Newspapers ran follow-up stories highlighting her daily service. Teachers, testimonials, and even interviews with families whose children had interacted with her. Editorials asked broader questions. Can consequence shape character? Can humility inspire community change? Can one person, when willing to act, demonstrate the power of ethical responsibility in a world often blinded by status and wealth? Alessia's journey through the cold mornings and quiet service became a living lesson, a ripple moving steadily through neighborhoods, schools, and homes. The narrative of privilege met accountability, and in that meeting the city watched a transformation unfold. Slow, meticulous, and profoundly human. The conversation it inspired would endure far longer than the headlines, planting seeds of reflection that stretch well beyond a single courtroom, a single fine, a single smirk. In its wake, the city began to ask itself what justice truly meant when combined with consistent, sincere action. December 18, 2025, arrived with a brittle chill, the kind of morning where breath hovers in white clouds and the streets carry the quiet hush of early winter. Alessia Moretti stepped onto the courthouse steps at precisely 10:06 a.m., a notebook clutched lightly in her hands, the leather straps of her bag slightly worn from months of service at Havenbrook. Gone was the polished confidence that once defined her entrance. In its place was a careful steadiness, a measured presence shaped by routine labor and reflective hours spent alongside children, families, and staff who lived the realities she had once only observed from a distance. The city seemed to hold its breath, the energy on the steps almost palpable, as if even the winter air recognized the weight of what had transpired and what was still being acknowledged. Inside the courtroom, Judge Caprio's gaze was firm but welcoming, a mirror of the day's gravity. The gallery murmured softly, the journalists who had tracked the story for months leaning forward with anticipation. Parents whose children had interacted with Alessia sat quietly, glances sharp, attentive. Hazel Durant, the crossing guard, her hands folded in her lap, kept a measured expression, though her eyes flickered with the memory of that rainy October morning. Tanya Turner sat beside her son, Caleb, his small fingers curled around hers, both poised to witness a conclusion not marked by punishment, but by reflection. Officer Riley, 14 years on the force, straight-backed and precise, shifted his weight, recalling the meticulous reports, the calls, the near misses. Alessia approached the bench with a calm, neither rehearsed nor hesitant. She looked at each figure in turn, Hazel, Tanya, Caleb, Officer Riley, and her voice, quiet yet resolute, began to fill the courtroom. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply. There was no flourish, no smirk, no attempt to charm. Her eyes met each person's, steady, human. "For your patience, for your guidance, for reminding me what responsibility truly is, for showing me what it means to face the consequences of my actions and to do something meaningful afterward." The room exhaled in silence. Words like these, free of entitlement, carried more weight than any apology written in haste or polished for headlines. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, his own voice measured but warm. "Alessia, the purpose of justice is not punishment alone. It is understanding, reflection, and ultimately transformation. Today you stand not to contest any judgment, but to acknowledge the journey you've taken. That acknowledgement, when sincere, is far more powerful than a fine or a sentence ever could be." His words hung in the air, the courtroom absorbing them like a lesson that transcended a single case. Alessia's hands unclenched, her shoulders dropping slightly as though a quiet weight she had carried since that October morning had finally shifted. She spoke again, addressing the community she had once endangered. "I learned more from showing up than I could have from any courtroom lecture. I understand now that my choices, even small ones, ripple far beyond me. I hope to continue learning and to continue contributing in whatever ways I can." Her voice, steady but imbued with humility, echoed through the space, the courtroom feeling larger, more intimate all at once. Caleb shifted in his seat, his gaze bright with a mix of curiosity and tentative pride. Tanya's hand pressed gently against his back, a subtle gesture of recognition. Hazel's grip on her own lap tightened briefly, an unconscious echo of the moment she had yanked Caleb to safety. Officer Riley's eyes softened just a fraction, the professionalism of months of investigation intersecting with the human clarity of a young person finally seeing, finally understanding, the consequences of privilege confronted by justice. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun glinted off the steps, highlighting the subtle expressions of those who had gathered. Neighbors, students, community members who had tracked Alessia's progress. She paused for a moment where she had once smirked, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. The memory of entitlement, of a life buffered by status and wealth, lingered only as a faint shadow. She absorbed the city around her, the children she had helped, the parents she had met, the streets she had once threatened with thoughtless action. In that moment, she understood something many never do. Accountability is not a loss of power, but the foundation of trust, the first step toward earning genuine respect. The story that began with a near tragedy at a crosswalk had unfolded into something far more consequential. Headlines would remember the Maserati, the fine, the unusual punishment. But those who had witnessed the quiet transformation, the consistency, the humility, the engagement with community, would understand its deeper resonance. Justice, when executed with fairness, reflection, and opportunity for growth, had a way of extending beyond a single verdict. It created ripples through a city, through individuals, and sometimes through hearts that had not yet learned the weight of responsibility. As Alessia descended the courthouse steps, the winter wind carried a soft clarity. She moved not with arrogance nor with relief, but with a measured understanding that accountability, faced honestly and embraced with humility, transforms not just the individual, but the community itself. The journey from entitlement to empathy had been painstaking, visible in the quiet acts of service, in the careful attention to others, in the willingness to face truth without defense. In that still, cold morning, justice revealed itself as it was meant to be, not merely punitive, but instructive, restorative, and profoundly human.